Got it. Hello, welcome to the session that Mary Patterson, Ellen Deutsch, and myself have put together, and we look forward to the discussion. The title of our section is Preserving Newly Demonstrated Healthcare Worker Resilience. Can old systems really learn new tricks? Ellen, start us off.
Sure. So in the old system, healthcare worker efforts were thought to be infinitely expansible. And the emergency department provides a good example of this. There used to be a bit of margin which supported efficient patient flow. But once the spaces where patients could be transferred to got filled, a wall appeared, and the ED held the patients as boarders. And then in the event of either a mass casualty or a pandemic, the ED starts using all kinds of spaces for patient care, like closets and hallways. And I'm going to give this back to Shawna.
So as we've progressed through the COVID pandemic, we've all been giving some thought, those of us on this presentation, about sort of what's happening. You know, how have we ended up in a situation where the healthcare worker organizations and larger global interconnected system are starting to fail, and especially having a sense that there's not, that the margins of safety have shifted and changed. So in referring back to Cook and Rasmussen's article from 2005 about system dynamics and going solid, the ultimate problem is that the boundaries have shifted significantly, so that there's a significant amount of economic pressure, as well as in the pandemic, beyond an acceptable workload boundary, to the point that it's starting to feel untenable, which ultimately then shifts that safety margin that's on the left ever farther closer to failure, and failures on a very large scale. This has actually become quite a visceral sensation for workers, that the sense that they know they're being squeezed, and more importantly, that they don't have many degrees of freedom within which to try to solve problems or obstructions or constraints. Next slide, Mary. Ellen. So when we think about this smaller space, the question becomes, what kinds of pressures are being exerted? Can we subdivide that a bit to better see them? And we're all aware of the gigantic number of patients that we're dealing with, many of them critically ill, and more critically ill patients at one time than any of us have ever seen in our lifetimes. As a result, there's limited inpatient capacity. There's been limited and major shortages in equipment and supplies. We're finding that suboptimal care locations have become the norm. There are facilities that have set up ED waiting rooms as critical care spaces. We're beyond using the aisles and the closets and the offices in the EDs to now putting patients in places that were previously just unfathomable. The production pressure has been tremendous. Part of that because of volume. The other part of the production pressure has been a result of the decreased revenue and budget cuts that have unfortunately resulted from changes in the financial makeup of the patients that are presenting with COVID-19 and their extended stays, ultimately raising and putting more pressure on that safety boundary by increasing pressures. The last three, the healthcare workers' frustrations and our burnouts, are definitely complicating this, because each of these becomes even more of a problem when there are fewer workers to help. And the politicization, for the political aspects, better term, of trying to develop strategies has truly undermined our ability to manage this pressure from the other direction, with staffing shortages, as I mentioned, becoming a problem. So if Ellen will give me a moving forward, the healthcare, our worker ability to adapt, and the pressure that we're exerting against this sort of summative group of only a sample of the obvious pressures that we know that the system is under is teetering, a word that was recently used by Mary in a previous conversation we've had, on the brink of failure. And as I said before, it's a visceral sense of failure. And those conversations that we've been having in our experiences have led basically to two questions. One, how can healthcare systems support their workers to sustain the current degree of agency and adaptive behaviors that they're currently exhibiting in order to manage the normal challenges that hopefully will at some point move back toward? And then the second question you see at the bottom, how do we deliberately encourage and develop the practice of resilient perspectives and behaviors and make it a positive as opposed to a negative? In the ED, we're used to this, not so in every other aspect of healthcare. Next.
So those of you who listened to our previous presentation heard us discuss how there were changes that evolved organically within the microsystems that we were dealing with in in situ simulation, and how the simulation team essentially developed a new role as a boundary spanner or an honest broker. And again, that was an example of a new way of dealing with uncertainty, and of dealing with risk, and ways in which we utilized expertise and shared expertise across various microsystems. And that's one example of a new way of functioning, a new way of exercising agency that healthcare workers, frontline healthcare workers, utilized during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And as we move, hopefully as we move into a post-pandemic era, we need to think about how we maintain that. So previously, I think we could all agree that there were organizational policies, regulatory requirements that really influenced and in some cases determined patient care processes. And we're all aware that work is done. What actually happened at the front lines was adapted, not necessarily always in complete alignment with the organizational policies and processes. But what happened during COVID is that because we did not have any guidelines to begin with, there were no rules. We had different types of resources or inadequate resources. Nobody quite knew what to do, and therefore our work is done, and we as frontline healthcare workers informed the patient care processes in an iterative way, and often also informed leadership and administration about what was working. It was different than our pre-COVID experiences, because we as frontline healthcare workers had the agency to develop solutions and to actually implement these, and even to inform additional microsystems or other microsystems and other healthcare workers at the front line as to how we could be successful in caring for patients. And so I think the question we have now is, the frontline healthcare workers have developed and exercised some agency that was not present before. I think one of the major questions we have is, are we able to preserve that agency, that ability to adapt successfully in the face of these challenges? And if so, how do we preserve that agency?
So another way to look at this is to look at the extremes of approaches to healthcare delivery. And in the left-hand column, you see avoiding risk. And we can do that for stable processes with well-known best processes, and resources are standardized and available. And in those cases, risk is excluded as far as possible. Power goes to regulators and supervisors, and the priority is prevention strategies. At the other extreme, if there's a mass casualty event or an infrastructure failure or a pandemic, then the priority is to adapt and recover, and risk is inherent in the events. And we embrace risk, which Shawna explains as we take responsibility, we own the risk. And the power goes to experts, those who have expertise. And this is, a simplistic, this is simplistic at the extremes. And the avoiding risk piece sort of fits into a lot of traditional quality paradigms. And I think the embracing risk fits more into more contemporary safety paradigms, but obviously there's a continuum and places where these overlap. But I found this, thinking about it as these dichotomies and then the overlap, helped me sort of sort out and not have sort of pendulum swings to extremes, but rather figure out where the best middle ground is. So there has been writing about how organizations work through crises. And the stage that we wish to be in now is recovery. I suppose we wish to be in resolution, but we're probably in recovery, and there is some back and forth between these stages. But recovery itself is a volatile, complex stage, and it requires a spectrum of capabilities. It requires the ability to balance priorities and maintain staff motivation and avoid burnout. And these are all dynamic qualities. It provides opportunities to capitalize on improvisations, innovations, and lessons learned. And it demands distribution of leadership input. So that means that the leadership, the expertise is distributed, which we know is true of complex adaptive systems.
So when we saw the paper from Gertz and started thinking about it from our perspective of resilience healthcare, it was quite interesting to see how the fundamental principles that Gertz was using for describing what the recovery phase would look like mapped quite nicely in terms of being synergistic with the four components of resilience, right? The four fundamental elements, in that recovery is going to require us to not only do planning, but to learn and anticipate and understand where we are now, what we've been through, what we're going to go through in the future, where we've been since the pandemic started over 18 months ago. And to use that information, looking at it from Gertz's perspective and from our resilience perspective, to see where we're going, to see where we need to be, how we can make healthcare more adaptive as part of the muscle memory of what we do as organizations, rather than as it has been for us, which is a overwhelming sense of firefighting without any sense that we're codifying or learning from the adaptations that we're succeeding with. Next slide. So we offered a couple of potential interventions for discussion, and we're very much looking forward to hearing other people's perspective. For us, the few that we wanted to put up is to talk about, acknowledge the fact that it would be helpful as we move into this recovery phase and try to build adaptive capacity into the clinical work, is that to be able to acknowledge hazards and uncertainty. That's sort of an old theme. We've been talking about it for years, but now they're much more overt. They're no longer latent, and we've had no choice but to face them in order to survive the pandemic. We also were thinking about a potential opportunity with reshaping policies and procedures and processes to be more goal-oriented than metrically oriented as they seem to be now. We also think that there needs to be a strong encouragement for acknowledging agency and for retaining agency amongst the healthcare workers that have dedicated themselves to getting us through these difficult times. I've had a number of people actually say to me, I now did something adaptive, which is interesting because that suggests that we didn't feel like we had that opportunity before. The last three we'd like to put out there is respect for the boundaries of human performance, recognizing that you can't continue to expand the human in hopes of solving and addressing problems. We have to readdress the system in order to allow there to be high quality performance, but also very safe performance. The last two being that we cultivate and value expertise. And this is this issue of what I mentioned earlier about muscle memory. We in the ED are used to being adaptive. We are adaptive in our personal lives and in our professional lives. It's built in like the muscle memory of an elite athlete. But that's not necessarily cultivated or expected in every other aspect of healthcare. And finally, we think it's important to seek and to surface and to seek consensus about priorities, constraints, and trade-offs. This is probably the first time in my experience of 25 years that we've actually talked very directly about constraints and trade-offs. But that conversation, we believe, should be even more obvious and consistent. So thank you for your time. We look forward to the discussion and we hope that this has been thought provoking.